Okay, take 3 of our first video lesson of the year. We're going to go through some definitions and basic information that we need to set us up for the content in Chapter 1. So, the official definition of statistics is the science and art of collecting, analyzing, and drawing conclusions from data. So, the science bit is really that collecting, analyzing, and drawing conclusions, whereas the art of statistics comes from understanding different methods and being able to apply those methods and choose the correct methods given the experiment or the data that we're working with. So, in statistics, we'll be conducting experiments, we'll be studying experiments, and what those experiments do is they involve individuals and variables and the relationship between the two. An individual is an object described in a set of data. Individuals can be people, animals, or things. So think of an individual as like the subject of an experiment. It doesn't necessarily have to be one single person or one single thing. It can be groups. It can be, a whole group of college students. It can be the population of a country. There's really a lot of variety here, but think of it as the subject of the experiment that we're conducting. A variable is an attribute that can take different values for different individuals. So um, these are like the characteristics of the individuals that we're studying. In the chart below, we have this is data that is coming from an experiment on different households. So the individuals here are individual households within the study. You can see these numbers here. Those are just like identification numbers. They don't really have anything to do with the data. That's just how we are identifying each household. Our variables in this study are the region that the household is in, the number of people in the house, the time that the individuals in the house have been living in that dwelling, response modes, this is how they responded to the survey, the household income, and whether or not the household has internet access. Within sets of variables, we have two different types. We have a categorical variable, which assigns labels that place each individual into a particular group called a category. And we have quantitative variables, which take number values that are quantities, counts, or measurements. So given, again, the same set of data, hold on, let me get a highlighter. We have both categorical and quantitative variables. Our categorical variables are going to include the region, because that's split into categories, regions in the United States. The response mode, so whether they answered via internet, mail, or phone, and whether or not we have internet access in the household, because that's just a yes or no question. You're either in the yes category or you're in the no category. Now, our variables that are clearly quantitative, so measuring a count or a quantity, will be the number of people in the household and the household income. Now, if you look at the time in the dwelling, yes, that's measured in years, which is a count. However, because in this study the time in dwelling was split into intervals, so 2 to 4 years, 10 to 19 years, etc., this is actually going to fall under the categorical variable category. So we have 3 categorical variables and we have 2 quantitative variables for this study. So let's look at this problem. Census at School is an international project that collects data about primary and secondary school students using surveys. Hundreds of thousands of students from Australia, Canada, Ireland, Japan, New Zealand, South Africa, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and the United States have taken part in the project. Data from the surveys are available online. We used the site's random data selector to choose 10 Canadian students who completed the survey in a recent year. The table displays the data. So here's the table. First, we want to identify the individuals in this data set, and then we want to identify the variables, and we want to classify each as categorical or quantitative. I will note that there is one other variable on that should be on this chart, but it got cut off. It is preferred communication method, and I believe the options were Facebook, email, text, in person, maybe over the phone. Okay, so let's start with our individuals. We are studying, if we go back to the last slide, we used the site's random data selector to choose 10 Canadian students who completed the survey in a recent year. So our individuals are the 10 Canadian students. However, with AP statistics, especially on the AP test, you have to be really specific when you answer the question, and we need to include the context of the question. So it's not enough to say 10 Canadian students. We have to be specific and say that the individuals in the data set are the 10 Canadian students selected at random who participated in the study or participated in the survey. And then part B, what are the variables? Classify each as categorical or quantitative. So let's go through categorical first. That's going to be the province which they live in Canada, the gender, handedness, so whether you're left-handed or right-handed, and then that one that I mentioned that's not on the screen, their preferred communication method would also be categorical. As for the quantitative variables, that's going to be number of languages spoken, your height in centimeters, and your wrist circumference in millimeters. When you have a quantitative data or a quantitative variable that has a measurement, so a unit of measurement, you do need to include that in your answer. So be sure to say height specifically in centimeters and then wrist in millimeters when you're answering this question. So here's just the solution from the textbook. Again, part A, we need to be specific and say that it is the 10 randomly selected Canadian students who participated in the Census at School survey. It is not enough to just say 10 Canadian students. Part B, there's our variables listed categorical, like we said, province, gender, handedness, preferred communication method, and quantitative, which is number of languages spoken, height in centimeters, and wrist circumference in millimeters. Notice that box at the bottom in red, just something to point out. It says there is at least one suspicious value in the data table. We doubt that the girl who is 166 centimeters tall really has a wrist circumference of 65 millimeters. That's about 2.5 inches. It's a really small wrist circumference. It says always look to be sure the values make sense. So we're not going to do anything with this data point right now, but as we go through the course, keep in mind that's a good thing to do is to look at the data and start to try to identify any that might not make sense or might seem out of place. Okay, let's talk about distribution. The distribution of a variable tells us what values the variable takes and how often it takes those values. So here are two graphs that display the distribution of two of our variables from the previous data set. On the left, we have what's called a bar graph, and that is displaying the number of students who answered each different type of preferred communication method. So we have cell phone, Facebook, in person, and text messaging. And on the left, you can see how it shows the number of students who answered each one. On the right, we have what's called a dot plot. This is typically better for quantitative data, whereas a bar graph we're going to use for categorical data. This dot plot is measuring, or it's displaying the number of languages spoken, so the distribution of the number of languages spoken. The options were 1, 2, 3, or 4. And so then above the number 1, we have just the number of students who answered that as the number of languages they speak. So if we had what looks like 6 students who speak one language, that's why we have 6 dots above the number 1. Whereas there's only one student who spoke 4, so there's 1 dot above the number 4. When we're analyzing data, we first want to examine each variable individually, but then also look at the relationship between variables. And then we want to identify which graph or type of method of displaying our distribution is best given the data set, which that's something that we'll work on. And then we want to add the actual values of those distributions. Okay, one more example. Jake is a car buff who wants to find out more about the vehicles that his classmates drive. He gets permission to go to the student parking lot and record some data. Later, he does some internet research on each model of car he found. Finally, Jake makes a spreadsheet that includes each car's license plate, model, year, color, highway gas mileage, weight, and whether it has a navigation system. So we're answering 2 questions. Identify the individuals in Jake's study, and what are the variables, classify each as categorical or quantitative. So go ahead and answer this question in your notes, and we will spend a minute or two on it at the beginning of the next class. That is it for today. I'll see you guys soon. Bye.